I'm not going to waste time counting. We are who we are, but in a room filled with this many chairs, we look like a smaller group. Or a group that doesn't like each other or something, I don't know, we're spread all out.
Yeah, everybody move up, come on, let's go.
Everybody feel comfortable, stay where you are. They can stay where they are. People are going to come in, I'm sure, to take all the chairs. What I thought we'd do today, I've sent out lots of information, so you know we're going to be talking about some topics about which there is some controversy in the country and probably in this group. I thought we'd begin by something I asked Sally Ann to read, a little prayer for unity. Sal?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's beautiful but humid. This is a prayer.
Closer to the mic.
Sorry, this is a prayer or reflection for unity. O loving Spirit of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a common spirit and inspire us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world. A world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and all the nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Thank you.
Amen.
Amen. Very nice,
Amen.
beautiful.
Well, in that spirit, let's start the conversation. I thought we'd start today, the first sort of primary topic will be critical race theory. We've talked about it before. Parvez Ahmed came, who was director of diversity and inclusion at Coggins School of Business at the University of North Florida. And we've talked about it before he came and since then. Who here understands, or I'll say it both ways, understands or has difficulty understanding what critical race theory is? Do any of you not understand critical race theory? That's better. That's the question more clearly. How about just the simple concept of critical thinking? Anybody talk about critical thinking or remember that concept from school? That's the second possibility. But critical thinking, can anybody give me a definition of critical thinking? What if I said, because I looked it up, but what if I said critical thinking is nothing more than looking at a situation critically, examining as much as we can all the facts, and making a reasonable judgment? It's pretty straightforward, isn't it? And yet,
So just satisfies critique. The word critique.
we need a mic here to go.
Just put in the word critique and you're on your way.
And develop that a little bit. Critique meaning,
Well, you look at a situation and you try to see the overall picture, and then you get more particular, and then it becomes more free, and you develop your own understanding of it.
the idea developed in response to a whole world that was based on rote knowledge, rote learning, dictated from certain sources, whether it be the Pope or the King. This was fact, and there was no dispute. And critical thinking came, like some people say, in the Renaissance, But in the Renaissance, they discovered the critical thinking that existed 2,000 years earlier. The notion of let's look at all the facts, not just accept what we're told, look at all the facts and make a reasonable judgment. That's critical thinking.
Looking at all sides of an issue, including facts, but not exclusively facts.
Wait a second.
It's looking at all sides of an issue as best you can. You can't just look at facts. Much of it is what people believe that are not factual.
That's exactly right. And if one makes the effort to look at facts on all sides of an issue, and again, for a moment, don't think critical race theory, think just critical thinking about anything, as opposed to listening to just the facts presented by an authority. You say, I'd like to hear all the facts and then make a reasoned judgment. Sal, we've got Carol Lee, and then John.
Critical thinking in literature is to think about the background psychologically, sociologically, take the facts into consideration, every aspect of, for example, if you're reading a book, you want to hear about the author, you want to hear all of the different aspects of things. And I think that applies to critical thinking in general.
Absolutely. One of the, John, you want to say something to apply it to medicine?
Oh, excuse me. Yeah, when you put theory after critical thinking, then it undoes the whole thing. I mean, critical thinking is self-explanatory. It has to be. But critical race theory, it just builds into itself something that's not understandable because it's a theory, and critical race doesn't mean anything in itself. So there you have the nonsensical term.
But what if you said critical thinking about race?
Well, then that's opens it up a little bit.
Yeah.
But it takes theory out of it.
Take the theory out.
It's this theory thing.
Because it seems to me you can't be a critical thinker if there's a dogma or a theory that you're supposed to adhere to. Does that make sense?
Well, you're supposed to be testing the theory all the time.
All the time.
Whether it's really a theory or for real.
And
race is for real.
well, but the idea of critical race thinking says for a moment we've only been listening to one side of the story. That's basically what people were saying.
Yeah.
Or hearing less than all of the story, if that makes sense. Does that fit? I mean, I want to take the idea
Well,
of
I mean, you're saying that this may be real and it may be not real. That's what a theory is. I mean, a theory is something that still has to be tested to know whether we can say this is something or not.
Well, I like that and I respect you for anything you say, but particularly that. I think that for a moment then, let's try to think about this subject not using the word theory. Because I associate in critical race theory the word dogma, that we're being forced to accept a dogma about the maltreatment of a group. Just a second.
But the people, legislatures are passing laws about this theory. That I don't understand.
Well, it goes beyond just what they're not just saying don't teach critical race theory. They're saying don't teach anything about that part of our history, anything that denies the glorious beginnings of this country and all that we have achieved.
I'll try to.
Joan and then Sue.
I'll try to talk about it.
She's talking about. I just asked my daughter who teaches diversity in a university what race theory really is. She says it's nothing but a social construct. Yes, we definitely teach and discuss and challenge the whole notion of race versus ethnicity versus culture.
Good. Sue?
Theory is not fact.
Wait. We got my behind you.
Other side.
Theory's a bad word.
Theory is not fact, it's just a postulation. It can be one thing or another, but it's not fact.
So I think it's helpful to not use the word theory, just talk about critical race thinking.
Right.
If that makes any sense. Although, Bill, or Bob, Bruce, Buster,
Anyone who gets up and gives a speech on critical thinking, and they go into some depth justice. And so critical thinking is a goal never to be achieved.
Exactly.
And so
It starts with openness.
whose thinking it is about critical thinking.
In part, it goes back to what we've been talking about in this group before about look at who the source. When you read something in the paper or hear something on television, who said it? Where are they from? What is their background? That's critical thinking. There's nothing more than saying, I want to understand the biases and the dogma of each of the people talking. And the notion of critical thinking about race, I really agree completely with John by associating it with a theory. The theory of critical race theory is that we've not learned as much about how the blacks have been treated as we should have learned. And it's a position that immediately becomes contentious. If, on the other hand, we start by saying, let's be open to hearing more facts about what happened, when it happened, and discern that partly on the basis of who's giving us those facts. What's their bias? What's their opinion? Does that make any sense?
Yes.
So if you're in school and you start doing literature, critical thinking about literature, I assume that's pretty non-contentious. I don't know, but you taught that, didn't you, Caroline, for a while? You taught literature.
Yes.
So the idea you tell your students, think critically about what you read.
Different ways to interpret.
Yeah, different ways to interpret. I think the notion in critical race thinking, for me at least, came to some level of distillation, let's say, when this Tulsa incident started to be part of the news last week. How many of you here knew before this week anything about a so-called massacre in Tulsa? You did know. Did you learn it in school, or how long ago did you know about?
There was a TV documentary about
Wait a minute.
4 months ago that presented the full background on the 1921.
So 4 months ago there was a documentary on TV.
Yeah.
But did anybody know about it before then? Don, you did?
I heard about it when I was in high school. I lived in Missouri, which is not very far, but I heard about it. It wasn't, no big thing was made of it, but it was presented as having occurred.
I used to think I knew something about the subject. I studied Black history. I've never heard of it, to be honest about myself. And when I realized there was something I'd never heard of, and I'll bet there are hundreds of stories not unlike that, that I just don't know about. And by the way, there are things, Phoebe was talking this morning about some of the atrocities that happened with the American Indians. I know a little more about that because it's a subject I've read about, but I'll bet there are incidents with the Shoshone or the Nez Perce or some tribe that are just as atrocious as what happened with the tribes in Oklahoma. I know nothing about. Critical thinking about it says, let's learn more. Let's hear more about what happened. What about the laws in our country against the federal laws providing housing assistance that included exclusionary language through 1965? How many of you knew that we did that? Couldn't get a veteran's loan to build a house, GI loan, couldn't live in communities that had FHA support. They literally said blacks need not apply. You don't get federal insurance or federal aid if there are blacks in the project. I didn't know about that. There's a book called The Color of Law that talks about the long tradition of exclusionary legal provisions that in effect created these poor communities. If you are not allowed to live in a community that has federal assistance at your school and federal assistance for your housing, federal assistance for your jobs, you're forced into these ghettos. Everything about your life is going to be less, it's likely that most of your life will be less successful than all the people who lived across the line. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, if it makes sense, is that not being open to the possibility that there are systemic provisions or structures that mitigate against blacks. Carol?
What about the fact that those
Hold
things
on,
have been
Carol.
corrected now?
Carol, give us a chance.
You know, all those things you named that were against them. What about the fact those things have been corrected now?
They haven't been.
Well, Joan just said, and it's true, not all of them have been corrected, and not all of them have been corrected everywhere. That's just a fact. Forrest?
Hold on, Forrest. This is very spread out, you all. That's why we want you all together.
Well, we tried.
And I'm not arguing with what you said so far, although I don't agree with everything about it, but I do want to point out that redlining, which was done in many areas of the country where you had, and you use the word ghetto, I'll call it that, just for practical purposes. There were ghettos where people didn't lend because of the crime, the foreclosures, the failed businesses, like bad neighborhoods that were not necessarily racist, and there was very little lending in those communities, regardless of your color.
And that, the interesting thing about redlining is that brought private institutions into the program, not just the federal government or the state governments. Redlining is a private action. Many corporations now include those that I ran. Simply wouldn't do business in places where there were risks. I mean, our job was to make a return on capital for our shareholders. It wasn't to invest a lot of money in poor neighborhoods where the returns would be lower. Full stop. I mean, and it wasn't a legal provision. It wasn't I'd like to think, it wasn't an active racist thing that I did, but it certainly happened.
I know about the segregation and things like that in the South, but in Peoria, Illinois, when I was a kid, the blacks had to be out of the town by sundown. Peoria, Illinois. I was shocked, and I must admit. I hear a lot of things like this.
You're the only person here as old as Bobby, so when you were a kid, I'm joking. Now, that's extraordinary that I literally had to be out of town by a certain time. Sheila?
That happened here in Florida.
Wait,
In
Sheila.
Fort
Wait a
Lauderdale.
minute.
After a certain hour, all black people were to be out of the neighborhood.
Neil?
Neil.
That's what I said.
It's interesting to hear all this, but as we speak, there is a massive wave of exclusionary laws going into a number of states, 12, 13, sort of brutalizing our election process at the local level. And if that's not, quote, critical thinking, I don't know what is.
I think that's totally true. We'll come back to that. Those laws. First of all, I want to, if I can set this up a different way. The discussion about critical race thinking was brought really to the attention of most people by Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd caused demonstrations last summer. Before that time, even the people who talk about critical race theory weren't talking about it. There were some schools, many schools, by the way. Bill Ross, who isn't here today, I don't see him, sent me a magazine from Georgetown University that described the actions they began taking 2 years before George Floyd. They created a department of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Georgetown. Now, they were thinking not just about inclusion of minority groups in this country, but inclusion of foreign students. Because it's Georgetown School of Foreign Service didn't have very many people at the time outside of the white community in the United States. And so their effort to diversify included accepting students and promoting applications from students all over the world. So what I'm trying to say is even before Black Lives Matter, BLM, the issue was being discussed, but without all the controversy. There weren't legislative actions in the states against this kind of thinking or teaching. It was happening because of good things. I included in the readings that I sent you 4 articles about Loudoun County, Virginia. Did any of you have a chance to read through those? It was fascinating to see at the local level. We're talking about 654 people, I think, were members of the Anti-Racist League, and they waged their battles on Facebook. I mean, the whole idea drives me insane. But that caused the prosecutor in the community, it caused the school board chairman to resign and go to Texas. It caused families to separate in Little Loudoun County. As you read that article, most of the articles were against the anti-racist group. They were against CRT. And they were talking about things that, you really just say, how in the world did we get to a point where that's the level of discussion? And that they're fighting in that community. And again, it's because the Black Lives Matter thing raised critical race thinking to a level where we're all talking about it. And that caused a reaction. And that reaction is, I think 40 states have proposed legislation banning the teaching of CRT. I think only 12 have passed laws banning that. Those states overlap almost exactly with states that have passed restrictive voting legislation. And I don't think any of those things would have been done. I'll come to the voting thing in a second. But the ban of critical race teaching, the ban of teaching about history of blacks that is being promoted in many schools is simply a reaction to this new thinking. And it's incredible to me. I was given something that I think I should just read out loud that relates somehow to this, how do these reactions begin? This is Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times. And a lot of people will say, judge your source.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Nicholas Kristof, he's educated, that's one thing against him. Joking. A starkly new public opinion poll. And again, PRRI, do you know what that is, Sheila? They're the pollster in this case, and they're probably from communist China, but I'm not sure. I'm joking. Indicates that 15% of Americans, mostly Republican, agree that, quote, the government, the media, and financial worlds in the United States are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation.
That's QAnon.
That's QAnon. Can you believe, I mean, who believes that stuff? And I hope everybody here would say, that's just stupid. 15% of some group of people think it's true. More alarming, he goes on, 15%, including 28% of Republicans believe, and this is something that scares me, 28% of Republicans, because things have gotten so far out off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. I mean, I hear that and I can kind of say, but that's certainly not true about us. How many people here think, Carol, you have something, I'm sorry, runners, you have to, Sally Ann's going to have a knee replacement surgery and she's a runner.
Because of this.
Talk about it.
Give me two of them.
Thank you. If you apply your critical thinking, you say, who took the poll? What were the questions on the poll? And do we believe it or not?
Yeah, I could agree.
This is, I think Nicholas Kristof is very responsible. However, you don't know how the questions were phrased. And that makes all the difference in the world.
That's why I jokingly said PRI is the People's Republic of Rhode Island, which is a communist PICO group. Forrest, Ken, we're going to put some people here with mics.
Thank you.
I don't like cherry picking numbers out of groups of numbers, and you're cherry picking numbers to me. If you had percentage of Republicans believe such, and the Democrats believe such and such, and whatever the variety of issues are, I think it'd be a lot more meaningful than cherry picking 15 and cherry picking 23.
I agree. The only thing that I have to start with is the poll. But I think I go to Real Clear Politics a lot, which is the collector of polls, and I think they try to be pretty fair. They give you a lot of different polls, so you have an idea. And they're, I don't know if it's there, but elsewhere I've read something about the background of each of the pollsters that are listed, and you kind of know there's some Rasmussen is going to always tilt in a certain direction, and other polls in another direction. So it's good to see all sides, and I'd like to see that question discussed on Real Clear Politics. The point I want to make, and I want to come back to another thing, how many people in this audience believe that the election was won on fraudulent terms, that in fact Biden shouldn't be president?
Can we substitute illegal terms?
Yeah, illegal terms. So if I show of hands,
Ask the question again.
how many people that our current president, Biden, was elected on terms that were illegal or improper?
And they're proving it in Arizona.
And the proof would be through the audit in Arizona. So it's, I would say, by the way, just a show of hands, that was 17.13% of the group when it started. That was very fast in the pollster business.
You're a comedian.
Not even up to
Can
1%.
anyone offer one scintilla of proof?
I'm sorry,
Can
sir.
anyone offer one scintilla of proof?
And Sue is asking for any of you to show proof, and the answer's
There
been,
is proof. In Pennsylvania.
we need a mic.
There's one little ballot that was bad in Pennsylvania. Yeah, well.
In Pennsylvania, there's absolute proof that they operated outside the law in Pennsylvania.
How? It was their law.
It was not their law. They ignored their law and did it anyway.
Because of COVID.
It was the Republican
What's he talking about?
legislature that passed those.
As the prayer said, that began this meeting. Nobody's going to get
The
to.
prayer is difficult to follow.
It's a difficult prayer. For all of us, it's a challenging prayer. I mean, and I accept the challenge. But the point I want to make here, Ken,
Well, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but my understanding is CRT causes white children to feel guilty, if that's the way it's taught. And whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but my question is, well, does it make black young teenagers dislike white people even more?
I think those are both very good questions. Can we just come back to that for a second? Because I want to stay for a moment on this issue of a belief system of a significant share of our population of educated, smart people, many of us call friends, and I do, almost every hand that went up, believe that the current president is not a legally elected president. That's mind-boggling to me.
In some states.
And well, but in those states, enough people would have voted had it been legal in a way that he wouldn't be president. 44,000 votes. It's not 7.5 million.
Hillary lost by 77,000.
Well, I thought it was 44,000. It's a smaller, way smaller number than the 7.5 million. But why is that? It's that way because our system is not really democratic. Our system devolves to the electoral college, where some states have much more vote than other states, much more popular vote than other states, yeah.
Well, I hear that repetitively from you and others, but the truth is this government was formed as a republic. It's not a pure democracy. Because otherwise you'd have the coastal states dominate everything in our lives.
Okay, the point that Forrest makes is one I completely agree with. If this country were a true democracy, one man, one vote, one person, one vote, thank you. If it were a true democracy, it's a country that would be run by California and New York. With a little bit of influence from Oregon and New Jersey. You know? Texas and Florida would be large and have a voice, but they don't have enough voice to overwhelm those two coastal cities.
Florida had more votes in New York.
Florida has more people there than New
More
York.
votes than New York.
More higher population than New York?
I believe that New York went to fourth and Florida's third in my opinion. And I think that's correct.
As a critical thinker, I want to look at the data on that. I thought New York still had more population.
It's California, Texas, Florida, and then New York.
That's interesting.
I believe so.
Then I'd have to add New Jersey and Connecticut in to get to be
I
right.
don't know what Pennsylvania, I mean,
But anyway, we have to go through the population. What you're going to see, though, if you have a pure democracy, is that some 20 states or 25 states would be virtually powerless.
Absolutely.
And the Constitution, written at a time when there were 13 states, and some were small and some were large, protected the small states. And that small state protection persisted through the present time. 50-50 in the Senate. The population represented by the Republicans is 44 million people fewer than represented by Democrats, but 50-50 in the votes. So it's not a pure democracy as such. And there are very strong arguments why it shouldn't be. You don't want to have a mob. That was the concern if everybody voted uniformly. Question, though, of being controlled by the coasts, let's say, even though Florida and Texas have enough votes to push against that, is not happy for anyone. And what's the solution? Is it to modify the voting regulations in the states, the 20 states in the middle? I mean, the fact of the matter is most voting restriction laws are coming in the states not on the coast. I find that interesting. They're coming in states that are already red states.
Hillary Clinton got real close to being the president of this country. Do you know how many counties Hillary won out of 3,100 and some odd counties? She won 57 counties. So,
The point is,
pure democracy.
democracy isn't who has the majority of counties, it's the majority of people. Devils.
No, in our system, it's an electoral vote.
I'm not contesting our system is not a
Not
democratic system.
necessarily a pure democracy,
Absolutely.
as it was designed.
And it was designed that way then, and I'm going to say it made a lot of sense then.
Do you think that makes sense now?
I don't think it makes sense at all now. I think it ought to be a democratic system. But I agree with you that if it were, it would not be at all what it looks like today, and there might be laws that hurt the middle of the country. And don't be mad at me.
I don't agree with you, but that's.
I know, I'm assuming every hand that was raised don't agree with me.
I really am not mad at you, and I've said it multiple times in this group, and I'd say it a dozen times outside the group or more, probably a lot more, because I really respect your organizational ability. I respect your preparation. It's enormous, and it's countless hours you spend doing this, and I really, truly acknowledge that every way I know how, to you personally, and in groups, and in this group. But I feel like that the title of the organization, so to speak, is quote, current events. I feel like a few weeks ago, you had probably 20 well-done slides on the difficulties the blacks have had in this country that are well documented. Then a few weeks past that, we had the Palestinians with 5 pictures of the desolate townships, or whatever you want to call them. And I think in the meantime, we've had some, what I call more, quote, current events, and I realize there's a war going on with the Palestinian issue included, which to me, there's no race war going on today in this country. Although I do believe that there's some racism, I don't think it's, quote, systematic, but I do believe that if we're going to deal with current events, there are a lot of current events that are really important issues in the world and in this country. I mean, we've got a president that is sold out to the left, supported by the press. He proposed a 33% corporate tax rate. He proposed a doubling of the capital gains rate, which would just absolutely death deals the growth of this country, which will cause all sorts of horrors that are unknown right now. And we've got issues like that throughout the world because of actions of a president who, to me, is somewhat pathetic.
So what you're saying is instead of talking about these issues, we should go to the less contentious issues like the president's actions.
I didn't say the less contentious.
I love it, man.
If you will, because Bob mentioned he was in Peoria, Illinois. I personally, as a child, lived in 6 southern states. I know all about racism in the 40s, the 50s, 60s, and less so since then. And the racists have made enormous progress, in my opinion, in spite of the federal government and with some help of the federal government. But the federal government also, in your information, which is more recent, is an indictment of what the federal government has done. We've spent enormous treasure, enormous manpower, enormous focus on the past. And we haven't done a thing, in my opinion, to help the people that are less fortunate, regardless of race. We haven't taught them how to fish. We've been having a plethora of food and saying, eat some fish we brought for you. And I think it's absurd. We need to teach people with a cane pole, with a spinning rod, a flat rod, or however they want, how to fish, because then they would learn what works in the world. Family structure works, discipline works, education works, entrepreneurship works. We're not talking about that in any government program that I know of.
Well, you know, I'd like to respond in one sense to this issue of teaching people to fish, because that's something very near and dear to my heart. If I may, we've still got a little bit of time to share this. Sally Ann and I started a mission program almost a decade ago in the Dominican Republic. The people that are there, and we've built about 60 houses and 2 schools. I've spent a good part of that 10 years in efforts that I call teaching people to fish. I've started chicken farms, pig farms, embroidery groups. I've arranged for us to get booths at the community markets in the local town and in the capital. And I have to say, at the end of a 10-year effort to do that, it's abject frigging failure. And I'm so frustrated by it, in part because it's so obvious we should teach them to fish and not give them fish. It's so obvious, and it's so easy for all of us to say. How many have tried it? It's just hard. Now, you go into a black community, and I'll use the word ghetto again, and you say we're looking for aspirants to the better schools, aspirants to the better colleges, aspirants to good jobs. There'll be some people, absolutely. And let's grab them and let's ride with them, because they will become leaders and they'll lead that community. They'll take their children to other communities where there are good schools, and where there are good jobs, and even further leave that community behind. Because who's left? When the better people from any poor community leave, who's left? And by the way, the people I've had the most success with in the Dominican Republic left the hood. And I can't blame them at all. You know, you want to live in a room with a dirt floor, you want to have a house in a community where your kids can go to a real school. Of course they're going to leave the butte. But who's left? And what in the world can we do with them, Bob?
I worked about 10 years in agricultural development projects, and what you're saying is absolutely true. But one of the keys that I found was that we built up USAID, World Bank, those folks. They built up a very sound kind of program, and they train people to be able to, administrators as well as the workers, to carry on all of that. And so there's some improvement, as long as Uncle Sam, I guess, is in there working on those projects. But when they change governments, often violently, they lose it all.
And it's amazing how little the aid programs help. Although what they did do, and the AIU was one of our partners in lots of the communities where what we did very well was get a very small handful of people to lead. We educated some people in the places where we had power plants, and I'm damned if every one of them did, as soon as they could, come to the United States or Europe or they get a better job. Yep. The doctors that are trained in the Dominican Republic get an incentive from the government. They get paid for 2 years if they'll just stay in the DR. And those that stay on the 25th month after graduation come to Miami. I mean, and I do the same thing. I left Idaho for the same reason. I'm sorry, I love Idaho, but not very many people who went to Ivy League schools stayed at home on the farm. All of which is to say, it's so easy to say, teach them to fish. But what most of the time we do is teach them to leave.
Excuse me, can I just add to that? In the Dominican Republic, we have had a few great success stories, not many, but young people who have been willing to take over leadership there. In the last year of COVID, when we and the people, our missionaries, couldn't go there, these young people continued with what we were doing. We have 6,000 people who are medical patients who are in the database for medical reasons, and they're continuing to get their medication.
And through.
And the elderly people, which is the group that you certainly cannot reach, an elderly group like us, no one's coming to our door to teach us how to fish at this point, right? That day is kind of behind us. So the same thing is true in these communities. The old people have absolutely no resources and no recourse. So we continue to feed them and basically give them food. It's all volunteers, and it's voluntarily contributed to through our church and other people. But the point is that it's wonderful to have the good luck of taking a young person and bringing them out in the world and teaching them and showing them and inspiring them. It's another thing for an older community. It's kind of hopeless, to be honest.
Neil, you wanted to add something to that?
I don't necessarily mean to be sarcastic, but I grew up in the Bronx, and I can assure you there were no fly fishing lessons there. Not one to be seen. And secondly, Sun Valley is in Idaho, but it's definitely not Idaho.
Well, that part, nobody from Idaho can afford to live there. It is true when you think about all the good things in life. They have so little to do with teaching people about business. It's succeed enough that you can get out of there and go to Idaho, or Jackson Hole.
But Bob, that's what was so tragic about Tulsa, among other things, of course, was the entrepreneurship there was beautiful, was starting businesses, right? And that was what was destroyed. I mean, literally wiped out. So I don't know, how many times can people take being wiped out?
And sadly, a great deal of the violence that we saw last summer, all the burning cars, the burning buildings, they weren't in the good neighborhoods. They were right there in the black neighborhoods that so desperately need businesses and desperately need anything that they can get. So the question that I grapple with a lot, and it goes back to this question of democracy. How much, if we've been successful in teaching people to leave and get more and more of them out and into the system, and partly they can get into the system, many of them can operate cell phones. They get into the system and do very well. They're integrated in. All this CRT, Black Lives Matter stuff matters very little to the few corporate CEOs that are black. I mean, they're running major corporations. They did things that are different from the communities left behind. What obligation, if any, do we have to the communities left behind? That, to me, is a question I grapple with all the time. Should we continue to do programs that are giving fish, even though we know that's not the long-term right thing to do for us? Does it make any sense, Rose?
I don't know if she does or not. I love her anyway, and I love Bob too. But it's kind of smart. But you've heard the definition of insanity is continue to do the same thing and expect different results.
As much as I totally agree with that, I do totally agree with that. I think that there are people, in that article Ross gave me, he talked about this one young student, and I read about this student and I thought, good Lord, there's hope for this world. She spent her sophomore year in Peshawar, Pakistan, her junior year in Baghdad, Iraq. She's back now at Georgetown studying foreign service, and she will eventually become one of our foreign service officers in an embassy somewhere. What a wonderful thing for this young woman to do. That's different. It's doing something different. It's not doing the same thing again, expecting different results. Now, back to those communities, whether black or brown, particularly now Hispanic communities, or white trash communities like mine. Good Lord, we did everything we could in our school to make it a better school. We weren't accredited to go to a university in Idaho. In 1962, we didn't have enough English or math to meet the state requirements, which is okay, you do a 13th year. But good Lord. And I could go to Harvard instead of going to the University of Idaho.
They needed a minority.
Because they needed a minority. Chandra's husband and I are great friends. He's from Oklahoma. And we used to joke all the time about how we got into Harvard. We were the geographically select of their candidates. And that's good. And we need to do more of that. At the same time, I believe it makes some sense to work on what's left behind. Even if we do sometimes the same thing over and over again, get the same result. Let's try to be smarter. Let's try to do it differently. But let's not stop trying. That's all I'm saying.
I personally think it'd be great if we recognized Emancipation Day, which was this month, when we freed the slaves, and spend a lot less time talking about the issues since then, because there's been great progress. If we want to celebrate the progress, we can do that also, but I think a lot of this stuff, we've wasted an awful lot of time going around the same bush.
What I think critical race thinking is to see both sides. And I think that sometimes in the critical race theory community, which is so focused on the disadvantages and the segregation and the maltreatment, sometimes they don't see the other side, the progress, whether it's emancipation or all the things that have happened since. The reason that you don't have to leave a neighborhood by dark anymore in Peoria is that there have been laws passed, there have been community initiatives taken, and it's a better world. Let's celebrate that as much as, but also
celebrate the opportunity they have today.
And celebrate the opportunity, but also recognize the left behind and efforts to do something about it. Bob?
The thing I think that surprised most of us was that critical race theory didn't come to the fore just a few years ago.
To Black Lives Matter.
In most of our
last summer.
And it had been ingrained, even in many of our elementary school, high school, colleges. It had been available and discussed in certain communities, not all of them obviously, but it was around and teaching young children things about sex and all of those things that most of us would not approve of, particularly in elementary school. And it came as a shock, certainly to me, that it was so ingrained. Why in the world hadn't I heard about it? I don't know the answer to that, except they were working very hard to keep it quiet. And Henniker, yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, in his article, discusses a lot of this. And he says it really started 40 years ago, mainly in the universities. And so it was just on the QT.
Well, long before the Black Lives Matter brought it to the forefront, institutions, because they looked at what the results, they said, we're an open, racially non-discriminatory institution. 2% of our professors are minority. 3% of our students are minority. Golly, is that really a non-discriminatory institution? We got to do something about that. And that happened in corporations and nonprofits across the board. People, and I'm going to say you're dead right about it being three or four decades ago, that they recognized the results didn't show much in the way of progress integrating their lower ranks. And that's when people started saying, let's create a department of equity and inclusion
And I think I can safely say that I probably in this audience have had the most Southern segregated upbringing of anybody. Even the person sitting to my left, who has this morning said he would love to see an Emancipation Day holiday, and then implies that that we should be satisfied with gradualism. And sure, they're better off now than they were in his childhood and my childhood in the 40s, and mine back in the 30s. But who among us would have been willing to tolerate the gradualism, that desegregation, which has never really occurred, and improvement of black rights and legislation to that effect? I'm sure that if I were doing it all over again, I would have been a black militant and a member of the Black Panthers and have done everything until I got killed someplace trying to get my rights when I was there and needed them. I think that we should keep trying hard, even though we have failed. And I used to admire Bill Cosby for a long time, and because he had great success, and he tried to bring up his fellow man with his success, and then he came on otherwise bad times that were inexcusable. But I would like to see a couple of dark faces in an audience like this, or some advertisement of Vickers in a place that might appeal to African Americans who might want to live in a place like this in their older years. So I think we have a lot we can do without risking being crazy because we're trying some of the same things. I think we need to turn up the speed gauge a little bit and try harder.
I love hearing from the elderly panel. Yeah, but what makes me so pleased about this community is the response that you just heard. There's an openness and willingness, and I'll bet just as much a willingness on the part of those who are Republican, a willingness to accept diversity here. And you know it, Forrest. You'd love to be more diverse.
It would not bother me.
It wouldn't bother you at all. Two other things I want to talk about very briefly before the day ends. First of all, I don't want to belabor any topic. I want us to talk current events. The reason I call this current events is that I looked at the headlines the last 5 days in a row, and states banning CRT and equity training were in the headlines in several papers, including the local paper. And so I thought it's a current event, and let's talk about it because we're reading about it in the papers and on the news. I said in a slide last week, and I was dead right because I'm so smart, that the violence in Israel would benefit two people or two groups, Hamas and Netanyahu. That because of that violence, he was a deadlock to win in his efforts to remain prime minister. I was only dead wrong. As you all know, Bibi is hours away from being history, at least temporarily. The question is not dead yet. Forrest says he's dead right. The question is whether this Yaden and Bennett's coalition will last more than a couple of weeks. It's a tough sell. It's the furthest left, the furthest right combined in a coalition against Bibi. I don't know how long that'll last, but I was wrong about that. An important thing to talk about at some point. Last week, the expectation of those who consider themselves experts was that there would be 1 million new jobs created. There was something like 250,000. And this week, the expectation was 675,000 new jobs. This morning, it was something like 560. Those are disappointing figures to me. I would have thought that with all the stimulus that's pumped into this economy, it'd be roaring. And there are lots of positive signs. But those numbers aren't positive. And I think the Biden team needs to really look hard at what's going on in a variety of different ways. Have we subsidized stay-at-home so much that people aren't looking for jobs? Is the unemployment or the continued absence of new jobs something we can isolate by economic sector, manufacturing or teaching or construction, or isolate by community or color? But something needs to be done on that point. And I think we ought to look carefully, as so many of you do, at each week's job total. But that better be going up soon. And maybe some of it has to do with the success of work at home during COVID. You hear a lot of people are saying, I'm never going to go back to the office. It makes no sense. I can work more effectively, take care of my kids, and thus not have the cost of child care. I can even homeschool and do all of that while I work from home. I think there's going to be a lot more of that. Otherwise, thanks to Sheila for the article from Nicholas Kristof, that biased left-wing pinko, who gave those isolated and clearly incorrect data on the number of people who believe in pedophilia.
Excuse me, Bob, can we go back to Ken Gorman's question
Oh, good.
earlier? Because I have a comment about that too.
Ask it again, because I think it's good.
Well, the CRT make white students, young students, feel guilty. And the other question that you don't hear of at all, is it making black students more angry at whites?
Those are two good questions. I'll let Sally Ann answer first. And
I just wanted to say that we take a lot of young people to the Dominican Republic in the last decade. They're usually 8th to 12th grades, and also young seminarians, just young people in general. And while I'm sitting here in a lily white audience, and most of my life is pretty lily white, in those cases, those young people I really see color blindness happening. They are so willing to not judge people by their color. Even, in those very poor bâtés, they're probably judging them by their economic disabilities and conditions, but not by color. And also, even though I think something like Ponte Vedra High School is probably pretty lily white, the black students there seem to be just everywhere with the white students. They're just not as struggling with some of these things quite as much as our generation is. I think I don't want to think about how difficult this problem has been. I want it to go away. It's terrible to think about it. And as you say, who feels guilty and who puts blame? There's probably some of that going on, of course, because violence will always exist, because humans can be violent. But in general, I see great hope.
If you look at that Loudoun County material that I circulated, what I find was interesting, and it really relates to your question, Ken, the people who were advocating more CRT were parents, and the people opposed to CRT were parents. There was no discussion of what the students wanted. My guess is that students are probably anxious to move on from that history. I think that I'm not saying it's negative, it's a bad thing to learn about it, but I think that the opposition and support is all taking place at the parent level. As it is, by the way, as it was in the book burnings that went on centuries ago. Most of the objections about what's taught in schools are parents objecting to what the kids are talking about when they come home from school. Oh my God, they're teaching you about sex? I'm not going to allow that. And you may all remember the opposition to sex education. I don't know if it still exists, but it was huge when I was a kid. And I'm going to tell you right now, my generation needed it probably more than anybody else. Cosby learned some, and Clinton learned some, but beyond that. But John first.
Speaking of guilt, guilt like complacency is a real guilt. And I was very much aware of guilt by complacency as I was growing up in the South.
Among whites.
Yeah.
And by the way, I feel guilt when I look back on our career and how I was going to say how few black engineers I recruited in a power company. It wasn't few, it was none. I didn't recruit at black engineering schools, and I'm embarrassed by that. And what's so interesting about it, and I thought about this morning, we hired one kid from BYU, maybe 25, 30 years ago, Brian. And surprise, surprise, over the next 3 years, several more BYU kids joined the company. They heard about it from Brian and his wife, and it's just what happens. Had we recruited 2 or 3, right, black engineering students, I am convinced they would have attracted others to the company. It was just, I'm embarrassed and ashamed we didn't do it. Len?
But then why didn't you do it? In other words,
You know-
was it that you didn't get resumes from people that were black that were applying for the job? Or it just wasn't something that you did?
It's really, in my mind, as I think about it, the primary positive message of this critical race discussion. It's not that I didn't want blacks or I was against it. It's that I just didn't focus on it. Just didn't think about it.
Yeah.
And we were working in countries that were all black populations. I mean, the more I think about it, the more angry I get about how just it didn't register. And 40 years earlier, when I graduated from college, I was almost 100% civil rights. Had a black partner, my first partner, black people in my company all the way through the power business. And then suddenly it was that feed. Oh, we're way past time.
Can I just make
One last comment.
My last point is simply this. I know where John grew up. My mother grew up 40 miles away. I'm a Georgia Tech graduate. The school today that produces more black engineers than any school in America is Georgia Tech. And more women, and more foreign.
And probably many more Georgians.
And more Georgians.
There you go. One last comment from Bob.
Really good. You got a head. I've never got a head.
Some of you know that I passed out.
If we all felt the same way, they wouldn't.
Wait a minute.
Just a second, Brian.
Hold on.
I have passed out at different times this article from Hillsdale College on critical race theory. Some of you probably already had it. Hopefully somebody read it. But anyway, I have a few copies, and I'll give them out, and yeah, and there's no charge.
And Hillsdale, as you know, is one of the non-controversial, absolute middle-of-the-road schools that teaches love and hope.
Takes no federal money.
And takes no federal money. Check the source. But read the article. It's good stuff. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week.